Welcome, everybody. It's a great pleasure for us to host the launch of Martin Revermann's new book. I say new book, it's not actually published yet, but it's due to be published later this month, on Brecht and Tragedy. And there are more than one reason why it's a pleasure, but an important one, certainly for me personally, is that Martin spent some formative postgraduate years here in Oxford, wrote a DPhil on Aristophanes, particularly on the theatricality of Aristophanes, that after much revision turned into his book on called Comic Business, which is a very important and I think widely recognized as a very important book in Aristophanic studies, and indeed in the study of comedy and of theatricality, because he already at that time had a great interest in semiotics, in theory of theatre, in the way that theatre works, the way that the players put it across to the audience, and the way that the audience receive it from the players. And since then, well, he's been very productive. He's moved, he has written on semiotics as such, but he's also moved into reception studies, both the reception of drama of the Golden Age in later antiquity and reception in more modern times. And increasingly in recent years, he has been homing in on Bertolt Brecht. And that has now culminated in this book, a very substantial book, nearly 500 pages, at least, and I've seen the proofs. And it is more than just a book about Brecht and tragedy, whatever that and may mean. It is actually a re-evaluation of Brecht in the light of his relationship to tragedy, particularly Greek tragedy, and a re-evaluation of what tragedy as a whole has to offer, particularly what it has to offer in the 21st century in our far from happy times. And I think I see it as a very ambitious book, which he hopes will lead others to consider a whole reinvigoration of tragedy in the light of the Greek tragedies, in the light of Brecht's tragedies, and in the light of the discussion of the relationships that reception can mean, and the relationships that comparative, as in comparative literature, can mean. But he, I know, will introduce the book himself, obviously, and give everybody a good idea of what it's about. But first, we're going to have a word from Michael Sharp, who is the editor, the classics editor at CUP, at Cambridge University Press. And Michael, if you could say a bit about this book and your series.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And I think I have the only physical copy in existence at the moment. This is what it looks like. And so thank you all for coming, and a big thank you to Fiona and the archive for the performances of Greek drama for organising and hosting this launch. It's great, it gives me great delight to be able to launch this book by Martin, who is someone who I've known now for almost 3 decades, since he came as a graduate student at Corpus Christi, Oxford, when I too was a graduate student there. It's always, this is the second time I've worked with him on a publication, and it's always a huge pleasure. He's so efficient and so professional and so dedicated. So I'm absolutely delighted that he published this book with Cambridge, and particularly published it in this series, Classics After Antiquity, which it's actually the 10th book to appear in the series. And the series was set up almost a decade ago. And it's a series we've published some wonderful things in it. There's books on recent books on feeling and classical philology, by Konstanza Gutenka, and translation, vernacular translation of Aristotle, and books on the afterlife of Nero, And there's a lot of other good things in the pipeline too. And I think just briefly at this point to pay a tribute to the 3 founding series editors, Emily Greenwood, Shane Butler, and Alistair Blanchard, who've done a huge amount to set up this series and make it a great success. And I should just say that actually they are in the process in the coming year of bowing out from the series, of retiring, but I'm delighted that we've recruited 3 excellent new series editors who will take over from them. Nandini Pandey, Edmund Richardson, and Eugenio Raffini. And I'm very much look forward to taking the series forward with them. So just before I hand over to Fiona, I'll say that I'm very happy to offer this book at a special 40% discount. It is a big book and therefore full price is rather expensive, but hopefully the discount will make it more affordable for now. And if anyone would like to buy that, then they should just send me an email. My email address is michael.sharp@cambridge.org, and perhaps Fiona or Martin afterwards can, or there it's in the chat, I think now. So so I'd be very happy to arrange for anyone who wants to buy it with that discount. Anyway, I'll now hand over to Fiona, who's going to say a bit about the book.
Yes, thank you, Michael, very much, and thank you, Oliver, for hosting tonight. And above all, thank you to Martin for asking me today to say a few words about this book that I've heard about, I've discussed with Martin over some years, and as Martin well knows, albeit at some distance and for considerably more years than Martin, I have believed that this book should be written because and if this is not oversharing, I've definitely overshared with Martin about it. I was a teenage fan of Bertolt Brecht, and when I became rather belatedly a classicist who, avant la lettre, seemed to be working on what we now call classical reception, I somehow parked Brecht to one side because, as I will go on to discuss and in rather more detail in a minute, because that was expected of someone who worked in classics. And so there are particularly personal reasons why I am so grateful to Martin for having written this book. I just want to, in a rather more formal way, say a little bit about the significance of the book, but I think it's important, as Oliver began, to explain the wider context of Martin's research, because I think what Martin has demonstrated consistently to us all is the benefits of working at the interface between different disciplines. And I think that was evident with the appearance of his first book, as Oliver has indicated, Comic Business, Theatricality, Dramatic Technique and Performance Context, or Aristophanic Comedy, which appeared in 2006. And right from the beginning, I think everyone knew that Martin hadn't just published what is still one of the most significant studies of Aristophanes in the past 40 years, but he was also beginning to work in areas that were very much of interest to those working in what was then still pretty emergent, pretty much on the margins, the sublist discipline of classics that we now call classical reception. And in chapter 2 of that early book, Comic Business, we have really, I think, one of the most helpful accounts of that 1970s performative turn in studies of the ancient plays that, of course, as Martin and I are both particularly aware of and deeply indebted to. It's the work that was really spearheaded by Oliver himself. And I think chapter 2 of that book is a really excellent account of that moment, but it also, I think, shows how Martin's work matters to classicists, because we have both analysis of the performance of, or in this case of comedy in performance, but alongside that, we have really high level classical philology and significant cultural history. And I think it's really important to hold on to those multiple strands of Martin's research, as I perhaps wish to highlight his next publication. And don't worry, these are all very important for this current book as well, because in 2010, Martin co-edited with Ingo Gildenhardt a really important volume with de Gruyter, Beyond the 5th Century, Interactions with Greek Tragedy from the 4th Century to the Middle Ages. Now, what that book did, and I understand it was not hugely easy to persuade publishers at that moment, but it filled a gap, a gaping hole in the reception of the ancient plays, and which traditionally in those days stopped abruptly. I know this is all, the landscape's changed very much. Traditionally it was stopping in the so-called decadent 4th century BCE, and then was usually only resumed by scholars working on textual transmission in late antiquity and the pre-modern period, in very highly specialized publications. And so this volume was the first attempt really to straddle the long history of tragedy from antiquity to early modernity. And it did so as, again, Martin and Ingo were well aware they needed medieval scholars to get into this conversation. And I think they did that at a time when it was still very, very difficult to persuade medievalists to join this important conversation. And I think if you read the introduction by the editors to this volume, you see today, you know, what is it, 11 years later, an excellent account of classical reception studies. And I know Martin went on to develop that in multiple other contexts, what was outlined about what was important about classical reception studies there. Because what he argues, and this is really important in his new book, and he argues persuasively, I think, is that subterranean receptions of the ancient plays are the way that scholars should go in the future. And in many ways, it is these subterranean pathways that have proved most rewarding for Martin in recent years. He's a scholar working across disciplines, and he has brought the best of comparatism, performance and classical reception studies into serious dialogue. And we know that that's a challenge. We've tried at the APGRD this term to kind of bridge what have really been the fault lines, especially the fault lines between comparatism, classical reception studies. And Martin has been definitely working in really exciting ways to bridge those divides, or that divide. And his cutting edge research, I think, consistently is pushing boundaries methodologically, and really demonstrates how theatre studies and comparative literature have much to offer classics in general and classical reception in particular. This latest project, the big book that Michael has held up, Brecht and Greek Tragedy, is Brecht and Tragedy. And I think if you look at the subtitle, Radicalism, Traditionalism and Eristics, you then really can understand how the book is informed by a reception and a comparative synergy that I think has been the hallmark of Martin's work for a number of years. Brecht, as I hinted at the very beginning of my talk just now, has in many ways, I think, traditionally proved a blank spot for classicists, not least because Brecht, of course, cast epic theatre in contradistinction to what he understood as the Greek model. The Greek model, of course, is mediated by Aristotle. However, I think recent research, not least research done here at the APGRD on performances of epic material, has reminded classicists that a return to Brecht can be illuminating, not least because the alleged opposition between epic and dramatic forms that Brecht had gleaned from his German Romantic sources, and Martin gives a very very full account of his reading of those German Romantic sources. By 1935, that opposition, that alleged opposition between epic and so-called drama, was far less clear-cut for Brecht. And from that time on, from 1935 onwards, Brecht is very consciously writing what he calls dramatized epic, and acknowledging, as Aristotle himself did in the Poetics, of course, that epic features can equally function in plays. However, refreshingly, I think, Martin isn't primarily interested in Brecht's conscious engagements with, and indeed Brecht's self-conscious rejection of, what he dubs Aristotelian classic ancient and modern tragedy. Martin's focus in Brecht and Tragedy is on the subterranean receptions, which include affinities, often unconscious, between dramatic texts across time and place. But this is not, and I really want to stress this, any naive ahistorical maneuver on Revermann's part. Instead, it results in subtle and incisive readings, which in turn send the reader back to the ancient texts as well as to the modern ones with new eyes. This is quite an extraordinary book. It's taken, I think, over 8 years to write. Martin may say it's taken longer, I don't know, but its riches are amply demonstrated on every page, and we're going to see quite a lot of those pages, I think, if Martin will share them with us later. I think it's a book that should have been written long ago, but it's equally a book that only someone with an equal grasp of Greek tragedy as a diachronic form rather than a mode, and someone with a deep knowledge of the history of modern European performance traditions. Only such a person, such a scholar, could have written this book. And I think it also sits really well with current scholarship on Brecht. And I think particularly of Olga Taxidou's rich study, just appeared in 2021, of called Greek Tragedy and Modernist Performance, Hellenism as Theatricality, which some of you may know. And in Taxidou's study, she cites Brecht alongside Eliot, Yeats, and H.D. And this, together with Martin's book, seemed to me to really recite Brecht now at the heart of anyone engaging with Hellenism in the first part of the 20th century. Brecht here does not sit alongside Eliot, Yeats, and H.D. No, Brecht is now in Martin's book center stage. No Brecht scholar, I think, would have limited the focus to tragedy, and I think this is where Martin's has an ability to do that. Why would they not? And forgive me, I'm ready for pushback if they're Brecht scholars who would feel differently. But I think quite simply because epic theatre's well-worn opposition to bourgeois tragedy, Schicksalstragödie, with its direct lineage to the German romantic privileging of the Greeks. I think that is reason enough for most Brecht scholars, most modern theatre people, not to write this, have wanted to write this tragedy. But opposition often, if not always, involves, as Martin's book shows so well, a deep knowledge of, even a deep fascination with an opponent. And Brecht's agonistic relationship with tragedy perfectly exemplifies this truism. And if Brecht scholars wouldn't have written it, I don't think many classicists, classical reception people would have given this project much truck either. For them, as still very much the case, Brecht is simply the rewriter of Hölderlin's boldly eccentric translation of Sophocles' Antigone. And if classicists think of Brecht's epic theatre at all until recently, it's, I think, narrowly construed as simply narrative theatre with very little, if anything, to do with Greek and Roman tragedy, or indeed with the epic poems. But I think what I have taken away from this book, and obviously Oliver equally, we have discovered how much a classicist can learn from Brecht's reworking of Sophocles under Revermann's tutelage, and just how prescient Brecht's reading, for example, of Antigone's relationship with Ismene was. There's also much to learn in Martin's study from Brecht's engagements with the form of tragedy. And I, for one, think that Martin's discussion of Brechtian choruses is really exemplary. I think here you can also learn much about the productive agon. Oliver's hinted already that Brecht conducted with Aristotle as both opponent, but also above all as interlocutor. And revealing too is the account of Brecht's reverence for Horace, which I, for one, had not known about. However, I think it is the overarching thesis of the book, which Oliver hinted at, that means it should command attention of both the classicist and the Brecht scholar alike. As Revermann shows, Brecht is a playwright, and I quote here, who modernized and repoliticized tragedy and brought it alive for 20th century audiences. Brecht, in this book, in Martin's book, becomes a key figure in the history of tragedy, rather than simply, as Nietzsche said of Euripides, the reason for tragedy's demise. So huge congratulations, Martin. I know that no one would have had either perhaps the time and the energy that you've devoted to this project to go through the archives as carefully and scrupulously as you have done. This will remain, in my view, a major study for many, many years ahead. And I can only thank you for all the hard work you've done.
Thank you very, very much, Fiona. Thank you, Oliver. And thank you, Michael, for your extremely kind and very warm words. And I'm extremely pleased and grateful that the archive is hosting this particular event. I should also thank the editors of the Classics After Antiquity series for their very helpful and constructive feedback during this entire process. And I should also, Fiona did mention the very strong comparatist aspect of the entire book. I should also thank the Center for Comparative Literature at the University of Toronto, where successive directors invited me to do graduate seminars on tragedy. And this extraordinarily interesting environment definitely helped me to formulate my ideas and to experiment with them. In what I have to say, I should tell you, I have two headings or rubrics which I would like to structure what I have to say on the book under. One of which will be the heading of journey, and the other one will be color. Journey, first of all, I'd like to share a little bit with you, yes, about my journey as I was writing this book. There's, of course, a personal aspect to this, of course, like for many of us, for me too. Brecht was a presence in school, and reading Mother Courage in high school in grade 10 left a deep and lasting impression, in particular, in fact, the figure of Catherine, and you will see that in the book as well. The other aspect is, of course, that I knew Brecht's Antigone, and I had this long-standing interest. And when I decided to move more seriously into the area of tragedy reception, yeah, I quickly became aware that this was, as Fiona said, very much a blank spot. What I also realized on this journey, as I embarked on this, I realized more or less immediately that just what I would call a genealogical focus, i.e. to focus on Brecht's direct documented engagement with, let's call it the Antigone complex. It's not just his adaptation of the Sophoclean/Hölderlin Antigone. It's what I call Brecht's Greek year, 1948. He's 50 years old. He's just come from exile in the United States, and he's trying to recalibrate and refigure. And precisely at that particular very formative and trend-setting year, he does, as many artists have done in the past, and I'm sure will do in the future, he does return to the Greeks. It's also the year, of course, where he writes and publishes the, then later, a year later, publishes the small organon for the theatre. It is the year where he stages, of course, the Antigone in this small provincial theatre in Chur in Switzerland. So finally, after 15 plus years of exile, he gets an actual theatre audience to work with. So this genealogical part, of course, had to be central, but I discovered very quickly that this journey had to be, if you will, a multi-stop journey, and that the book would have to be more, and that the Greek year, if you will, in 1948, has to be embedded within a much larger project. And this insight, early insight, is reflected in some of the early publications on the topic I put out, but also in the macro level structure of the book. And I should say in a minute's time or so, I will screen share and take you actually as part of this journey through the table of contents and so forth. But let it be said right now that the book has a tripartite structure. So there is, after the introduction, there is part one about, yes, this point of contact, as I called it, 1958, Brecht's Greek year. Which has all, if you will, the usual suspects, the organon, detailed discussion of the Antigone production, the model book, not forget the model book that actually derived and grew out of this particular production, the Antigone model book, and that it's a whole format then on model books, and of course the immediate reception of this particular radical experimentation. Part two I call positionings, and what I do in part two is I step aside and then increasingly adopt a comparatist mode to try to refine Brecht's relationship with the Greeks, be it performatively via Sophocles, be it conceptually via Aristotle, with Brecht's relationship to other quote-unquote classical traditions. I start with kind of the furthest afar with Asia, and then naturalism, Schiller, Shakespeare, and also talk about comedy in that particular context. And then part three, which is essentially of equal length as part one, so it's a very substantial part, I call comparative exploration. And these comparative explorations, I do what Fiona very much emphasized. Essentially, I take Brecht's experimentation with tragedy conceived as the big four, as he called it, and then take the reader on a journey through key moments in Brecht's oeuvre and discuss individually these plays from the viewpoint of tragedy, things to do, yes, with heroism, chronotopes, chorality, justice, closure, and so forth, then become the comparatist, the lenses with which Brecht sees the material, remolds the material, but also analytical tools with which I think we can understand Brecht better. Before I go into the screen share and take you a bit through the material and a bit more detail, let me also say that I was able to do a lot of archival research at the Brecht Archive in Berlin, and I would like to thank very much the director and all the staff members at the archive for their enormous support during this particular time. Before the screen share, just two more really bigger points I wanted to make, and things I feel I discovered. One is that one through theme in the book is that I believe Brecht works and can quite clearly demonstrate this, that Brecht works with two conceptions of tragedy. There are two tragedies, if you will. One is this monolithic conception of tragedy as tragedy of fate, as Schicksalstragödie. And that is essentially a worldview in which there is ultimately no human agency, where humans are subject to some kind of fate that then pre-structures and predetermines their particular and limits, of course, the changeability of the world as is. And that is obviously both an ideology and an art form that Brecht very strongly rejects. That's, by the way, not something he gets from Aristotle. He cannot get this from Aristotle because Aristotle doesn't develop the notion of tragedy or fate. He gets this from German idealism, He gets this, I think, very much from his school training, and he gets this from exposure to certain interpretations of Schiller, for instance, and this kind of thing, and from certain performative practices, like Yesner's Oedipus in the late 1920s. More about that later. As opposed to tragedy conceived as tragedy of fate, there is, and as a limiting and narrow view and artistic art form that has to be resisted, there's also a very enabling conceptualization of tragedy, and that is tragedy as the big form, as Brecht called it, the big form. He called it the big form in a very important, early, very short review article called Later Stage Oedipus from 1929, really fundamental and foundational piece, where he argues that the new big issues of his time, unemployment, the increasing radicalization, of course, and economic despair and so forth, the big issues of his time necessitated a new big forms. And that too is a through theme in this book, asking the question, what kind of big forms, with tragedy conceived as the big form, are needed to tackle aesthetically the big issues, while at the same time letting art be art, letting art be light and fun and entertaining and so forth. The second big thing I would like to highlight at this point is that I believe there are two Aristotles as well. There's one Aristotle that is, if you will, the historicized Aristotle, the Aristotle of the Poetics, which Brecht did read really quite carefully. And that's something that people didn't really know until very recently, until really Brecht's copy of the Poetics became available in the Brecht archive in 2007. And I'll show you some slides about that later. So there is the intellectual presence of Aristotle as a theoretician. On the one hand. On the other hand, Aristotle also becomes a label for Brecht to denote essentially pre-Brechtian drama. He does this especially by linking Aristotle with the notion of empathy and identification. So Aristotle then very much also becomes the theorist who is to be connected with a kind of theater which Brecht also rejects. Theater that tries to lull in the audience, and that gives them an emotional upheaval, if you will, hypnotizes them, dramatist, hypnotist, this kind of thing. And that's, of course, precisely something that Brecht resists. So an audience has to be alert, an audience has to be critical, and an audience has to have fun. So Aristotle then becomes emblematic of this kind of tradition, and that's the kind of Aristotle that is then in the subsumed, if you will, in this label non-Aristotelian. Often it really is the case in Brecht's writing that Aristotle becomes a thinly veiled cipher for naturalism. Brecht's in many ways most kind of vigorous and also most successful and most important antagonist throughout his artistic life. At this point, let me go into the screen share and perhaps also straight away highlight something that I had marked out to you as my second visual signpost, and that would be color. I'm very grateful and very fortunate that part of what I think sets this book apart is the publication of the first publication ever of very, very, very important archival material. So in the book, you will have the complete set of 38 in total color photographs of the core production of the Antigone taken by Brecht's collaborator Ruth Berlau in 1948. It is, to the best of my knowledge, the only Brecht in color that is actually available. So that's the color works in two ways, really. First of all, yes, we are able to see Brecht in color. But secondly, as you can already guess, one of my real concerns and one of my real objectives in the book is to demonstrate Brecht's colors. and to demonstrate how incredibly interesting, diverse, colorful, enriching, gripping his work in fact actually is. Regularly in my work, you will see the notion of Brecht's notion of tragedy as a playground, as someone who throughout his life experiments with form and who reshapes, of course, a political conception of form. Form is political, but there's the fun, the experimentation of experimenting with form. So bringing color, interest, curiosity, and shades into our reading of Brecht, I think is extraordinarily important. Just a few things about this cover picture here. This is the only one not taken from an actual performance, but clearly from the rehearsal. Here you see BB sitting at the back, Helene Weigel as Antigone right here. You see this, these two concentric circles, the various props right here, actors sitting on the outer circle when they're not acting. Here you see the masks. Again, the color pictures are indispensable here. We did not know and could not know from the other documentation that the masks actually had two colors. This is here white, and later you will see that the other side of these masks was red. That's people a bicolor, a binary, a bipolar view and take on the mask. I opened the book with one particular notion and one particular feature of this mise en scène, namely these columns right here on these big poles. And these are actual horse skulls. These are horse skulls that were boiled down actually for this particular production and put up on these poles. The impresario who managed and made this particular production possible, Hans Koyl, a very perceptive critic, he remarks on the mise en scène that there was not a trace of a Greek column, nicht die Spur einer griechischen Säule. This is how I open the book. And as you can see, and as classicists will very clearly see, yes, these are not Greek columns, strictly speaking, but of course, these are Brecht's versions of Greek columns. This is how he morphs, how he transforms, how he remolds and reshapes Greek columns right here. So this is how I open the book. It's a very interesting, revealing misreading on the part of Koyl to believe that there are no Greek columns on stage. Yes, these are Brecht's reworkings of these columns. And I found this to be particularly telling, actually, of what I see as a widespread misreading of Brecht. His radicalism and experimentalism is rightly emphasized, but it's emphasized, if you will, while turning a blind eye to his traditionalism, when the two, of course, go hand in hand. That's one of the main contentions of the book, that Brecht's radicalism cannot possibly be understood without understanding his traditionalism, and that he, of all people, is always extraordinarily aware of that. This is also where in the subtitle, the last item, Eristics, comes in. I've deliberately taken, it's a slightly defamiliarizing use of the term, of course, a bit of a fremdung on my part. What I mean by Eristics is, of course, eris, the Greek term for strife. Brecht very much saw himself really absolutely in the same league as Sophocles, Shakespeare, Schiller, and so forth. From very early on, he has a very strong sense of an artistic mission. He sees himself as productively, of course, engaging with this and competitively engaging with this particular tradition. And these were, of course, benchmarks he had to live up to and work with. It's, of course, as we all know, it's an enormous heritage to, if you will, pick up, if you will, this contest, let's call this creative contest, with the likes of Sophocles, Schiller, and Shakespeare. But that's one of the things I want to demonstrate. This did not weigh Brecht down. It gave him wings to fly. At this point, let me briefly take you a little bit more through the table of contents at this point. So the introduction does try to set the stage, the heuristics of reception, and a number of things I've just been talking about also on the methodological front. I then in the introduction discuss and lay the groundwork for some important material aspects really that I look into. There is Brecht's personal library. Let me at this point pass briefly go to one of the archival materials. There is, or there was, an urban myth among quite a few Brecht scholars, I feel, that Brecht either did not read the Aristotelian Poetics or that he read it only very superficially, and that can be falsified by material evidence, and that is his personal copy of, in this case, Alfred Gutmann's translation of the Poetics, published by a minor Philosophische Bibliothek in 1921. I'll never ever forget when I worked in the archive in Berlin at the Brecht archive, the moment when the archivist came up to me with the actual copy of this book, which is in some underground storage in Berlin somewhere. So she had the copy in one hand, and in the other hand she had a pair of white gloves for me to look at it. Here you can see the annotation, so you can actually demonstrate by actual physical evidence that Brecht read it, he read it several times. There are pencil annotations in different colors and so forth. There are also, and this is unique actually in Brecht's personal library, there are machine-written inserts cut to size so they can actually be inserted into this particular book. And I've given you one of these inserts where Brecht talks about chapter 25 of the Aristotelian Poetics and talks about the peripeteia, essentially from good fortune to bad fortune. And here his comment is that this kind of one-off peripeteia may be sufficient if theater were just something very emotional, ein rein emotionales Geschäft. But in order to present modern processes, you need not just one up and down, but more ups and downs, several ups and downs. Leider ist zum Verständnis moderner Prozesse mehr als ein Auf und Ab, ja sogar mehrere Aufs und Abs notwendig. I discuss all of this in the book in some detail. At this point, the bigger point to make here, and at this point I'll just quickly go back to the table of contents. The big point to make here is really that Aristotle for Brecht is an extraordinarily and exceptional companion. He has a few of these companions. Confucius is one of them. But there is, and I would argue, no one who in Brecht's intellectual topography is someone he engages with such level of care and such level of detail as Aristotle. And the Brecht's personal copy is very much actually a sign of that. Jesnes Oedipus and the entrenching of Brecht's notion of the Schicksalstragödie, and a topic that may interest quite a few of you is this notion of how much Nietzsche is there, in fact, in Brecht's relationship with tragedy. And my argument here is that there is very little, in fact. Point of contact, I talked about this already with setting it up. 1948, year of crisis, year of decision, year of reorientation, the small organon. A chapter, then of course a detailed analysis of the Antigone production itself. And at this point I would like to show you a couple of these, again, first ever publication of these color pictures, which I do think are put Brecht in a very different light. This is from the end of Brecht's Antigone, which by the way is a hybrid of an adaptation, a translation of a completely new play. And in this particular ending, the messenger dies on the stage and the chorus members right here put their masks on the body in some kind of funeral rite. And here you see the color scheme as well, right? The red side of the masks and here the white side of the, so Brecht cynically refers to it as the mask of peace, which Creon has been wielding deceptively. Here in this particular scene, here you see a maid coming on later to lament this dead messenger. The scene itself harks back to Schiller's version of Orleans and to Brecht's own St. John of the Stockyards as well, where also the deceased heroine is then covered by these flags. So it's itself, the scene already establishes this pedigree. Sophocles, Schiller, and Brecht. Another of these color pictures, I love this one very much. This is Helene Weigel here in the inner circle with Ismene right here. Brecht, Fiona briefly alluded to that. Brecht stages them as twins. So he scripts them as twins. They are supposed, they have identical costume. At the same time, that's a very typically Brechtian technique. It's, Weigel is 47 at the time. The Ismene actress is in her early 20s, and it's quite clear that they are not of the same age. So it is at the same time transparent that they are putting on twinhood, if you will, at this particular time. And that's of course an extraordinarily Brechtian view, to put something on and to make transparent certain contradictions. You see the prop here on the outside, and you see the urn right here. Brecht was a meticulous craftsman as a director and put great emphasis actually on the sheer beauty of objects. Okay, at this point, let me try to wrap it up and speed up a little bit to take you just quickly through this table of contents. As Fiona mentioned, it's a big book. It's 500 pages. In a, I guess, Brechtian fashion, I've done a lot, I hope, to increase the use value of the book and make it easy for readers to navigate. So you have this navigational table of contents right here, where you can really find whatever interests you. I should also highlight that I wrote a specific and specifically structured quite a long conclusion, which has these subsections right here, which also will help you to navigate the entire book. And yes, it's entirely possible and actually quite a good way, I think, of reading the book, to read it from the back and to start with the conclusion first. Positionings. So I'm sorry, the last part of part one, the model book, an extraordinarily interesting and innovative format developed and created by Brecht. Part two, these positionings, the other Brechts, Asia, naturalism, and related diseases. Big problem about naturalism. Naturalism does make social problems visible but not transparent. Sichtbar but not sichtig, so it's superficial actually in its representations of social conflict. Schiller, an enormous talent without any value. That's a quote from Brecht himself. Into this chapter also put the very important connection with tragedy and the comic and comedy. In Brecht's conception of the tragic cannot really exist without the comic. The two dialectically coexist, and there's hardly any work by Brecht where there's not a strong comic element as well. So I discussed some of these tragic comedies at Rui, but also for those of you who've been wondering, yes, there is a quote-unquote genealogical link with Greek comedy as well. Brecht did an adaptation of Aristophanes' Plutus of his wealth. Around 1940, it's only preserved in fragments. He quoted the Aristophanic Pluto Review, where it comes all with a Thespis cart and with a chorus of the Peloponnesian Club of Nations and with pink clouds and very innovative Brechtian inventions. This is the very first discussion ever, actually, of these particular fragments, and I've also in an appendix translated these fragments into English. So if you're looking for something of resembling a genealogical link to Greek comedy and to Aristophanes, that's the place to look. Shakespeare and the Road Beyond Tragedy. Shakespeare's reception is extraordinarily important and slightly exceptional in that Shakespeare always is au concours, if you will, for Brecht. He's always this extraordinary, exceptional talent and genius who Brecht will then co-opt, but not really oppose. And the Coriolanus adaptation is a prime example of that. And then in part 3, the comparatist explorations, Mother Courage, Brechtian Chorality, Threepenny Opera, The Good Person of Szechuan, with what I call tragedy shaming, Mahagoni, The Measure, extraordinarily innovative, radical piece of what I think is anti-tragedy. This notion of heroism, and here I talk about a virtually unknown fragmentary Brecht play, the Judith of Shimoda, which I think in an exemplary fashion demonstrates how Brecht adapts the big form to talk in this case about a heroine. Here he has he adapts a Japanese naturalist play, and he adds an internal audience. And these internal audience members discuss the play as things proceed, and they smoke tobacco, and they have alcohol, and they have all the things that an ideal Brechtian audience does, which is to have fun and to enjoy, if you will, the lightness also of art, even as they watch the tragedy of one individual unfold. And then the Galileo as another prime example of this exploration of tragedy in the big form. To conclude, let me focus on the conclusion and these 14 subsections in the conclusion. I've limited myself there always to 1,000 words to give everybody a gateway, if you will, into the book. The utility of looking backwards, Brecht's utilitarian approach to reception. The Antigone has to do something for us if we are to do something for it. Something which has always appealed to me in putting these things to the test. Schicksalstragödie and barbaric theatre, that's what Greek theatre is, polemically speaking. Barbaric theatre, it's inhumane, it's Schicksalstragödie. Form, tragedy, politics, tragedy as a creative playground, theory, tragedy, and Brecht's Greekness. The shadow of Euripides. One thing I found is that quite often there are Euripidean features there, but Brecht himself is actually more as unaware of Euripides and any of Euripides' plays. It's quite interesting that nonetheless there's this convergence clearly of interests, and not surprising, but very interesting. Positionings and the role of ancient Greece, the role of empathy and dissonant responses. Brecht's tragic women, that's a topic I find increasingly interesting. How Brecht, reinvents, rediscovers, repoliticizes women. And of course, he's picking up on something that's inherent in the Greek tragic tradition as well. I found that very liberating. The topic Brecht and women is very much shaped by Brecht's autobiographical relationships with women. I found it very, very enlightening to set that aside and really to look at women in Brecht and to use the tragic template to look at them. Then a very, very different and complex and very interesting picture emerges. The question of tragic violence and how Brecht deals with tragic violence, and it really tries to expose systemic violence as opposed to individual cases of violence. What is tragedy good for? And tragedy is, of course, one of the means to demonstrate that the world has to be changed. In other words, tragedy needs to point to the possibility of its own annihilation, if you will. The dialectics of tragedy and comedy. And then lastly, this is what I would like to end on, looking forwards, tragedy and Brecht for the future. Now, this is a chapter or a section that's very important to me personally, because I do hope that the book will invigorate people. First of all, there are two things as this book now undertakes its own journey. I hope very much for two things. First of all, I do hope that the book will very much receive a very diverse readership, people from all kinds of disciplines, classics, reception studies, but also die-hard classicists, die-hard Brechtian scholars, of course, comparatives, theatre studies people, and so forth. I also, secondly, very, very much hope that the book will read a young audience. And I hope that many of you will find the book helpful also for your teaching. This is how I conclude the book. One thing I did discover, let me perhaps stop the screen share at this moment. One thing I very much discovered as I was wrapping up is when you look at modern instantiations of tragedy, David Gregg's The Events, Margaret Edson's Wit, which dramatizes the painful death of ovarian cancer of a woman, the dance piece Betroffenheit, by Jonathan Young and Crystal Pite in 2015, which is inspired and dramatizes the loss of children in a fire. I heard reports that in some of these performances, actually some audiences members had to walk out. They could simply not bear to see this kind of human tragedy unfold before their eyes. But the majority of people stayed. And when you look at these particular plays, from a Brechtian point of view, you very quickly realize what enabled people to sit through these tragedies. What enables them to sit through these tragedies is the use of Brechtian techniques: montage, juxtaposition, humor, clown, commentary, the expansion of chronotopes, i.e. the life that you see ending in Edson's wit, for instance, of cancer right now, is a life that is now embedded within a larger picture. In David Gregg's The Events, the chorus is extraordinarily important because it's a source of communal cohesion and solidarity. In other words, Brechtian techniques are so prevalent because they enable us to, yes, enjoy tragedy, and they enable us to sit through it, learn from it, and then get these extraordinarily important emotions like joy, interest, energy, that for Brecht are the precondition of aesthetic enjoyment, the condition for learning, and the precondition ultimately also of change. This is where I should stop and would like to stop. So I'm handing over to you, Fiona.
Or to me, Martin, perhaps.
Or to you.
Thank you very much. I thought that gave a wonderful idea of the ambition of your book, the passion of your book, and the interest. And I just love the way that you bring out that Brecht, in effect, rejected Greek tragedy for things that were false ideas about Greek tragedy in favor of Brechtian things that are more akin to Greek tragedy. Fiona, we said an hour, but I think we can give 10 minutes to discussion, don't you?
If people have questions, yes, and Martin's happy to answer.
If people would put them in the chat, anything that people would like to raise. Let me just, those very recent examples you gave of the revival, if you like, the re-energizing of tragedy, but they didn't sound like much fun, and you kept on emphasizing Brecht's that aspect of Brecht.
Well, I mean, David Gregg, the events, they do sing at the very end, and Edson's, yeah, I mean, I think fun, enjoyment, essential lightness. That's something that really is pervasive in Brecht's writing. There's this wonderful ending to The Small Organon. Art is the easiest mode of existence, and fun can also just mean, if you will, a measured, if you will. It doesn't have to mean that we're all kind of in cracking with laughter and this kind of thing, but a sense of relaxation, a sense of enjoyment. I do think here, for instance, there's possibly a very strong link actually between, unbeknownst to Brecht, between Brecht and Aristotle, this notion of catharsis. Catharsis probably, I think, means in Aristotle something to do with the reduction of an excess of emotion, some kind of healthy mean, healthy middle. That's also fundamental for Brecht, this notion of what he calls Durchkältung, in an important theoretical piece on Chinese acting. Durchkältung means colding through. And the way I like to illustrate is when you buy a cup of coffee, it's piping hot. It's emotionally it's hot, but it's unpalatable. It has to be made palatable by being tempered, if you will, and being brought down to room temperature. This is not coldness, not cold feet, it's not cold coffee, but it's palatable. And I think it's a lot of this enjoyment actually is about managing emotions to such an extent that viewing these tragedies become palatable and measured, and healthy experiences. Same with Brecht's theories of acting, where again, the actor is always supposed to be very much aware of demonstrating and not embodying. Brecht is clearly very much concerned with things like mental health for an actor. Again, it has to be palatable, manageable, and only this is ultimately enjoyable and fun.
Good, thank you. You're asked to say a bit more about the Jesna Oedipus.
Yes.
And the relation to Trauerspiel.
Yes. So the Jesna Oedipus, that takes us to 1928-29. That is a very important production, because that is a production of very much in the Schicksalstragödie tradition of seeing the Oedipus. It's a conflation of Oedipus the King and Oedipus at Colonus, and Helene Weigel herself actually played the newly created part of a maid in this particular production. So I think it's important for Brecht on two fronts. I think it corroborates actually his view of tragedy or fate, and his strong association actually of the Greek tradition with a tragedy or fate. And secondly, although that's hard to prove, but we do know that he was clearly impressed by Weigel. It's quite reasonable to assume that they would have rehearsed the part together. So I do think that this is very important for Brecht's, if you will, understanding of tragic tone. There's some very, very important fragmentary plays from that period. This is for the non-Brechtians among you, the Fatzer fragments and the fragment of the bread store in the Brotladen. And I talk quite extensively actually about these as well at various parts of the book, in the chapter on chorality and so forth. And when you look at these fragments, you can already see Brecht very much adopting, if you will, a tragic tonality. Actually, it almost sounds Hölderlin-like, some of these Fatzer fragments, or some of the gesture of the bread stalls have choruses and this kind of thing. So I think the Jesna production is quite formative for Brecht. It also then leads to, and is the occasion actually for this very important short theoretical piece, Later Stage Oedipus from 1929. That's essentially a review of Jesna's production combined with Brecht himself advertising the Three-Penny Opera, which just premiered and was of course a huge success in that particular season, as two examples of this new big form that is being found for big issues. So the Jesna production, in some sense, has a dual function. In some sense, it solidifies Brecht's notion of Schicksalstragödie. At the same time, it also shows ways, because he felt definitely the second part, the Oedipus of Colonus, was quite innovative and interesting. He also sees how tragedy as big form can be reformed.
Thank you. There's another question. To what extent do you think Brecht is engaging with the German tradition of ideas of the tragic, or to what extent is it more international?
Yes, I mean, Schiller clearly is the crucial, and you have a chapter on Schiller there, of course. Brecht does take note of Schiller, of course, both as a playwright, and Wallenstein, for instance, is Brecht's first informative theatre experience, himself actually in his late teens. This whole connection that Schiller sets up between morality and freedom and so forth, that's of course all in Brecht's ballpark. So there are obvious connections. Ultimately, however, the relationship with Schiller is, if you will, strained. I mean, Schiller is this very much bourgeois playwright, and he provides material to react against in the St. John of the Stockyards, Natura Ui, of course, as well, in the ending of the Antigone as well. I do think Schiller is very important for Brecht linguistically. I think he provides him with tragic language, both as langue and as parole. He knows how to, if you will, reshape and how to use blank verse in this kind of thing. And this whole distinction between epic and dramatic in the Small Organon, he does mention Schiller, and the notion of the epic mode somehow as liberating, because in the epic mode, you are now actually in the third person, in the past tense, you are able, yes, to move as an observer. You have this freedom, this kind of detachment. So in that sense, very, very important. But I do think that Aristotle is the more important one. And I do think that ultimately Aristotle is the significantly more useful one for him. And he realized that. He realized, and says this frequently, that he shares with Aristotle the conviction of the importance of plot, of mythos. In the Macintosh, Aristotle's definition of tragedy from chapter 6 of the Poetics is quoted, in fact. So he very much sees and positions himself relative to Aristotle very consciously. Ultimately, Brecht himself phrases it in this way: Schiller is an enormous talent without any value, because he's still a completely bourgeois German classic, and he comes with a tradition of reception that itself is disabling, and that's something that needs to be superseded.
Fiona, I feel like I should be drawing things to a close soon. I mean, is there anything that you would like to add before?
Well, I noticed there's one other question, maybe rather a big one, but it relates to the translation of Brecht into English. And does the translation play any role, or does it play a major role for your conception of your book and the performance history? And is there maybe, sorry, I hope I'm not misrepresenting the question, but I just wonder, is there something quite kind of missionary, on your part? Are you addressing very much the Anglophone world in this book, because you have been kind of concerned maybe about Brecht translation? I know we've been gifted in many ways with recent new translations of Brecht's plays, but
I do think there needs to be more of a discussion about Brecht translation. The book is bilingual, so all Brecht quotes are, and I have a brief note about this, all quotes are given in both languages. I think we need to talk more about it. To give you one example, the Durchkältung, right, is translated by Willett as coldness of theatre, and that's, I think, manifestly not what it means. It doesn't mean cold theatre, it means palatable theatre, making theatre, yes, enjoyable and bearable, and so forth. I do think there needs to be an ongoing discussion, and I deliberately juxtapose these texts so that people can make up their own minds. I think that's also very Brechtian, this notion of transparency. But even more important than the question of translation for me is the question just of reading Brecht. I think, and I just hope that the book will invigorate people, scholars in early career stages, undergraduates, graduate students, fellow researchers, to see how rich and rewarding Brecht is, to start reading him closely again, and then to use him, perhaps what I have to say about him as well, and then go off and do their own thing, and really put Brecht to the test as well, and do essentially to Brecht what he did to Sophocles and Schiller and Shakespeare, and look and put him to task. And yes, we can only do something for Brecht if he can do something for us. I found that very, very helpful. But in order to do that, we need to start reading him carefully and with a new and critical mind, because I do think this whole notion of new big forms for these new big issues, climate change, AI, social injustice, and so forth, that really is something that should click with many people.
I think that does make a very good conclusion. There's quite a detailed double question for you from Mark Silberman, which perhaps you can pursue afterwards, but that made a good peroration. Martin, thank you very much for giving us such a very good idea of your book. Congratulations on completing it. Publication coming up. We drink to the health of the of all participants, as well as to your volume. And thank you everyone for joining us. It's been great for us at the APGRD to host this occasion. Thank you very much, Martin and everyone, and goodbye.